Patterns and isometries. How is math related to these topics? Whether you know it or not, patterns exist in our everyday life. Whether that be in nature, music, or simply in our daily routines. But how exactly do we define patterns? Patterns are a group of objects that are connected with one another due to a particular rule. They can also be called a sequence in which a limited or unlimited number of members can exist within it. Patterns can also be symmetrical, meaning that it can be the same on both sides of a given center point or axis. Now, there are many kinds of patterns, but for better understanding of how patterns work, let's focus on the following, namely rosettes, frieze, and wallpapers. First, we have a rosette pattern, which has either of the following types of symmetry, cyclic or dihedral. A rosette pattern is considered cyclic if it has a rotational symmetry around the center point, but no mirror lines, meaning that there's no reflectional symmetry. Then, a rosette pattern is considered dihedral if it has rotational symmetry around the center point, and also mirror lines, meaning that there's also the existence of reflectional symmetry. Okay, now moving on to a frieze. This pattern is a design on a two-dimensional surface that is repeated basically in one direction. This is often seen in architecture and decorative art, like for example on the Parthenon in Athens, Greece. Now lastly, we have a wallpaper, which is a pattern that has translation or sliding symmetry in two directions, or can also be looked at as an arrangement of friezes stacked on top of one another to fill an entire plane. We often come across wallpapers inside of our homes and other buildings, yes. Now that you kind of have an idea of how patterns look like, let's look into isometries and how it's related to patterns. So what are isometries? These are what help in the formation of patterns, otherwise known as rigid transformations, in which the size or shape or position of original figure is changed in order to create new figures. There are four types of rigid transformations, namely translation, rotation, reflection, and glide reflection. First, we have translation, which is the movement of sliding. This is when an object is moved in a certain direction and distance in order to create a new image. That means that in this transformation, every point in the object must be moved in the same direction and for the same distance. Next, we have rotation, which refers to the turning of a plane figure around a fixed center point called the center of rotation by a given angle in order to create a new figure. Then we have reflection, in which a geometric figure is flipped across a line, the axis of reflection in other words, and therefore creating a mirror image. Lastly, we have glide reflection, which obviously is the combination of a translation and reflection. So in a glide reflection, the translation is first performed on the figure, and then after that, it is reflected over a line. Now there's a special kind of transformation in geometry, aside from the main four, called a dilation. What makes dilation different from the four main transformations, however, is that, first of all, a dilation pertains to the shrinking or magnifying of an image. Meaning to say, unlike the other transformation, it's non-rigid because even though it retains the same shape when it performs its transformation, the size of the figure changes, so it cannot qualify as a rigid transformation in this case. Alright, let's summarize what we just learned. So, we know that patterns in objects that are repeated in a sequence, patterns are just objects that are repeated in a sequence, right? And that there are many types of patterns such as rosettes, friezes, and wallpapers. Next, we know that patterns are symmetrical only if they are the same on both sides of a center point or axis. Furthermore, isometries or transformations are the ones responsible for the creation of patterns. It can be classified as either rigid or non-rigid, depending on whether or not size is retained in an image. Rigid transformations are translations, rotations, reflections, and glide reflections, while non-rigid transformations are dilations. Now you may be wondering, why is it important to know about this topic in mathematics? You see, patterns help individuals to develop their analytical and problem-solving skills as they try to identify specifics and isometric changes given a broad picture. It allows one also to make educated guesses as to what a result may be based on recurrences, as well as to connect and appreciate the natural world better. So overall, patterns are the ones that are responsible for keeping our lives in order and for explaining how everything in our world is connected. Our last topic for today will be on game theory, and we will answer the question, how can math be used in playing games? So what is game theory? Game theory is basically a framework for conceptualizing social situations between competitors. It can also be defined as a science of strategy, or the best decision-making of players competing with one another in a tactical setting. Game theory's main focus is obviously the game, and how its players' payoffs are dependent on the strategies used by their opponents. A game recognizes player statuses, preferences, and possible strategies, and how these strategies influence the game's end result. There are actually many classifications of games, but today let's just focus on 7 kinds, namely simultaneous versus sequential, complete versus perfect information, cooperative versus non-cooperative games, as well as a zero-sum game. First, let us compare simultaneous versus sequential games. In a simultaneous game, players choose moves without being aware of the moves of other players. Also here, players have to make their moves at the same time. A good example of this type of game is rock, paper, scissors, where first of all, players are unsure of which of the 3 moves their opponents will pick, but have to make sure that they carry out their moves at the same moment as their opponents. In contrast to this, in a sequential game, one player gets to choose their move before the others, which allows for the other players to decide what they will do based on what the previous player has done. In other words, a sequential game requires players to take turns, and therefore their turns or their moves are done at different times. A nice example of a sequential game is checkers, because 2 players here keep track of each other's actions and also take turns moving on the player board. Next, let's move on to a game of perfect information versus complete information. We're gonna distinguish the two. So, in a game of perfect information, all the rules, possible choices, and past history or previous moves made by other players are known to everyone. Although the players here are unaware of each other's intentions or motivations, as well as some of the game structures. Chess is an example of a game of perfect information because two players are aware of how the game goes, what possible moves they can make, and what moves were previously made. Although we have the fact that players are unaware of each other's intentions and they don't know how one will structure all their game materials in order to win. So that's why this is considered a game of perfect information. Now, a game has complete information, on the other hand, if the structure of the game, as well as the set of strategies and payoffs of players, are commonly known to everyone. But players here might not know the previous moves made by other players. For example, in a game of Battleship, this is a game of complete information because all players know the rules and outcomes of the game. However, the first player, for example, does not know where the second player placed their battleships and vice versa. Okay, now let's proceed to comparing cooperative versus non-cooperative games. So, starting with cooperative games, players here are allowed to form alliances or coalitions, meaning that they can negotiate binding contracts and share in payoffs. Cooperative games can also be further classified into two forms, namely extensive and normal. And for better understanding of these forms, let's have these represented through the popular prisoner's dilemma model. So, in extensive form, a cooperative game is represented as a kind of tree diagram, in which each strategic decision is shown as a branch point. Here, the diagram starts with prisoner A, who has two choices to make, so either to confess or stay silent, and the same goes for prisoner B. It is possible for the prisoners here in a cooperative game to know the strategies of one another, and you see that their jail time is largely dependent on the decisions that they make together as a whole. Now, in normal form, a cooperative game is seen in a table of numbers, basically, with the strategies listed on the borders of the table and the payoffs of the players in the table cells. As you can see in the cells, the numbers on the left of the commas corresponds to prisoner A's decision to confess or stay silent, while the numbers on the right side of the commas correspond to prisoner B's decision to confess or stay silent. I guess, in a way, the normal form is much easier for people looking at the game to identify what is the best strategy for players to take. In the case of the prisoner's dilemma model, the goal here is to get prisoner A and B to make decisions that will allow for the both of them to serve the least amount of time in jail. Now, comparing cooperative games to non-cooperative ones. Non-cooperative games are basically the complete opposite. So, players are not allowed to form coalitions, or rather, players cannot form the structures required of them to allow cooperation and optimal results for all. Therefore, decisions made are self-interested and made independently. Relating non-cooperative games back to the prisoner's dilemma model again, the only time that this model can actually be seen as non-cooperative is only when the prisoners is only if the prisoners did not coordinate beforehand about their strategies and payoffs. So, meaning to say, the prisoners end up making decisions based solely on self-interest. Now let's look at the last classification, which is the zero-sum game. Zero-sum game, yes. Now this type of game shows how one player's gain is equal to another player's loss, in which the sum of the player's payoffs should equal to 0. The game of heads or tails is a perfect example of a zero-sum game. Because if one player is able to predict the side that the coin will land on when flipped, that player will then get a point, while the other player who guessed incorrectly will lose a point. Yes. So, now that you might be asking, why is it important for us to know about game theory in life? Well, let me break it down for you. So, game theory, basically, it can help any individual become aware of the benefits and consequences of their actions and make more rational decisions knowing all of this. In business, for example, game theory helps business owners decide if it is a great idea to open a new store in a different location, if they should lower the prices of their merchandise or services in relation to their competition, and much more. Also in economics, game theory is used in buying stocks, for example, as people try to invest their money with companies in the hopes that they will do well and that their investments will earn them more profit in the end. In other words, game theory is useful for one to know because it allows one to think critically and determine what the best strategy is in the situations given to them. So now we have some ending remarks. So we'd like to thank you guys so much for watching our digital videos. We hope that you learned something valuable about mathematics in the model world from our digital stories. Now signing off. Thank you. We are the Arithmetic Ventures. And this is the end of our digital story presentation. Thank you.